Let me also put on some captions. Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Sophia Lamb, and I'm a graduate assistant for the Georgia Climate Project. Today, we are going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the bill that passed. And our presenter is going to be Blair Beasley, who is the Director of Climate Strategies for the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. So during this talk, we're just going to go over how the US Congress passed an ambitious national climate bill or climate policy called the Inflation Reduction Act. And Blair is going to dive into how we got here and what it does for the US and what it means for the US greenhouse gas emissions going forward. So before we get started, to anyone who is new and does not know much about the Georgia Climate Project, I would just like to introduce y'all to us. So we are a coalition of colleges and universities across the state of Georgia that works towards building a statewide network to address the following questions that you see on the screen. So what does a changing climate mean for Georgia, and what can we do about it? This is a list of our partner academic schools. We currently have 11 schools within our coalition, but we're always looking to grow bigger. And we also just wanted to give thanks to our funders, because without them, we would not be where we are today. And so if you're attending this event, you are attending a Georgia Climate Scholars event. And so the GCP Climate Scholars is an initiative of the Georgia Climate Project that aims to cultivate a community of scholars from GCP partner schools across the state. So all undergraduate and graduate students and recent alumni who are interested in climate change from GCP partner schools are welcome to participate in Georgia Climate Scholars events. If for some reason you feel as though you don't fall under one of these categories, no need to worry, we still love to have you here. We also just wanted to put this on everyone's radars. Every other year, the Georgia Climate Project helps host the 2023 Georgia Climate Conference. So this year we'll be hosting it at the UGA Conference Center and Hotel in Athens, Georgia in mid-May. If you are a student who is interested in the arts, we will be having a arts competition that you can submit some work for, then be presented at the conference. We will also be having a call for abstracts. So if you have something that you've been working on related to climate, we'd love to have you apply to share it. And there's also a potential opportunity to give several lightning talks, which are 2 to 3 minute talks, just talking about what you've been working on. And so if any of that sounded interesting, feel free to follow us on social media. You can also visit our website. We do have a newsletter that you can also sign up for on our website. So with all of that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass on the slideshow to Blair.
Great, let me get it queued up. Let's see, can you guys all, let's see if I can get it to go live. Can you all see the slide deck? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So prior to joining the Ray C. Anderson Foundation, I spent about 10 years working in DC on federal climate policy issues, primarily with a think tank called the Bipartisan Policy Center. And so this is perhaps my favorite conversation to have, which is what are we doing at a national scale on climate policy? I have been talking to groups like this for many years about kind of the state of our federal climate policy. And for a long time, there just wasn't a lot to report. In fact, I had given talks in the past that actually ended in some people in tears, which was, the fault of mine. So it's nice to be with you all to actually have some good news to share about what we're up to. And so I'm going to dive in to a story of how we got here and where we're going. I like to see where presenters are kind of headed with their conversation. So this is the plan for the day. I'm going to give a very brief overview about why do we need federal climate policy, and then talk about the rocky road on the path to where we are today. And then I'll spend the remainder of my time kind of unpacking what is in this bill and some key themes and takeaways. I know it can be difficult on Zoom calls for people to kind of weigh in and ask questions. So at the end of each of these sections, I'm just going to check in with people and see if they want me to pause. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them as we go, or at the end, if you kind of want to wait and save them, that's fine as well. Okay. So why do we need federal climate policy? This is global CO2 emissions, atmospheric CO2 concentrations. It's from kind of a famous data source known as the Keeling curve. So there is an observatory out on the Mauna Loa Observatory out in Hawaii that has been taking atmospheric CO2 concentrations since 1958. And you can see them charted. The older data is coming from ice core data. And you can see we have had variations in CO2, atmospheric CO2 concentrations in the past, but we are on this kind of vertical rise, as you see now. That's kind of an outlier. I checked just last week, I think we're up to something like 419 parts per million. So those are actually levels that we have not seen on planet Earth in millions of years. And as a result of these emissions, we have actually already warmed our planet more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So that's one thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We are, in fact, in a climate crisis. The other thing to keep in mind as we talk about policy is just where are the emissions coming from at the US level? So this is a graph out of a group called Rhodium Group that's showing US greenhouse gas emissions by sector. You'll see in the, back in the past, the green line was the power sector. That used to be our primary source of national greenhouse gas emissions, as we had a lot of coal-fired power plants, which are heavy emitters. But as natural gas has gotten cheaper and renewables have gotten cheaper, it's made many of those older coal plants uneconomic. They've begun to retire. And you can see that now the blue line, transportation, is actually the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our country. As we electrify and make our existing gasoline and diesel powered fleet more efficient, it's actually projected that the orange line, industry, is going to be our leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the near future. Think about things like producing steel and concrete and other heavy industry. And then at the bottom, you can see buildings. So it's helpful to have that kind of in the back of your mind as we talk about the different policy levers that we're trying to pull to reduce these sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, my first pause. If there's any questions kind of setting the stage of why we need climate policy, happy to take them. Okay, well, Congress has actually known that we have a greenhouse gas emissions problem for a long time. In fact, in the late 80s, Congress held its first big hearing on climate change. And since then, they have attempted several times to pass major federal climate legislation through the US Congress. So I'm going to give what is perhaps the quickest tour onto the failures of the US Congress to pass major federal climate policy to date. I could have started this road back in the Clinton administration. We would have been here for too long. So instead, I'm going to start with the Obama administration, because that was really the first big run at passing a federal climate bill. So there was a bill called Waxman-Markey. It would have set an economy-wide cap on greenhouse gas emissions. And it did so through a policy called cap and trade, which for each type of emitter, each source, it would have gotten a limit of how much you could emit. And if you chose to emit above that, you could buy the permission to emit from other people in your sector that had overcomplied, which is called cap and trade. It also did other interesting things like set a national renewable portfolio standard. So just to set the scene, Obama's in his first term. He's promised to act on climate. His party, the Democrats, actually run the House and the Senate, so they have majorities in Congress. In fact, the Senate has a larger majority than we see today. They actually had a 59-seat majority. And so here comes Waxman-Markey. Behind the scenes, we have business and large environmental groups that are negotiating on what they are willing to accept from Congress. And they're able to pass this pretty ambitious bill out of the House. They send it over to the Senate. As I mentioned, they had 59-member majority. But if you're trying to count votes in the Senate, unfortunately, the number you're counting to is 60, not 59. So you need 60 votes to sustain a filibuster. So under a filibuster, any senator can say, I don't want this bill to move forward. And you need 60 votes to overcome that filibuster. And as I mentioned, they only had 59. So Harry Reid was the majority leader. He actually was unable to count to 60. He never could get 60 votes to support Waxman-Markey. And so he actually never brought this bill to the Senate floor for a vote. Instead, the midterm elections happened. This was Obama's famous shellacking, where he lost so many, his party lost so many seats that the Republicans took over both the House and the Senate, and thus killed federal cap and trade policy. And we have not seen a major attempt to bring this policy back. Instead, there was some attempts to do some smaller scale things. Instead of looking economy-wide, there is a market-based policy called a clean energy or a clean electricity standard, which is a market-based policy just aimed at the power sector. Remember that green line, it was by far and away our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The power sector is also really important because the pathway for many other industries to decarbonize is to electrify. So there's extra reason why if you're just going to try to pick one sector, you'd pick the electricity sector. But once again, they were unable to get enough votes. So Obama had promised that if Congress failed to legislate, that he would regulate. And so he turned to the bureaucracy, he turned to the EPA, who put forth a regulation called the Clean Power Plan. So the Clean Power Plan would have limited CO2 emissions from the existing power fleet for the first time. As I mentioned, if you're going to pick one sector, it's going to be the electricity sector. And he actually was able to go all the way through. They finalized the Clean Power Plan. It was a pretty ambitious policy. But before it ever took effect, the US Supreme Court actually stayed the rule. So they said, EPA, you cannot enforce this rule till it goes through all of its litigation. Then Trump won the election. He remanded the rule back to the EPA, put out his own rule in its place called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, the ACE rule. It actually had some credible legal challenges showing that it was actually so weak that it may actually increase CO2 emissions. And so the courts remanded it back to EPA again. And we have not seen the EPA under the Biden administration put forward another electricity sector policy under the Clean Air Act. All right, so then there's a kind of gap in my road. That gap is the Trump administration. There wasn't really any attempts to run federal climate policy under the Trump administration. In comes Biden, and he comes up with a very big and ambitious policy called the Build Back Better Act. It took on a bunch of different priorities for this administration, including about $500 billion worth of climate and energy spending. Notably, it included kind of a unique version of a clean energy standard as part of that package. So it had this backstop in it. The Build Back Better Act did pass out of the House, but it was kind of dead on arrival in the Senate. It ran into some headwinds that need, with the very slim Senate majority we'll talk about in a minute, notably Senator Manchin. And so that bill was not passed out of the US Senate. So this was the rocky road to date. I will say that doesn't mean nothing happened over the course of our past administrations. A lot did happen. It just wasn't comprehensive. And so we did see some incremental legislation. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but under the Obama administration, his stimulus funding, the ARA bill, had about $90 billion in climate and energy spending. We also saw many must-pass bills that were going to pass out of Congress, like the 2020 omnibus budget bill, end up having some pretty significant climate legislation that kind of hitched a ride on it. So this was under the Trump administration. The big budget bill in 2020 included legislation calling for the phase out of hydrofluorocarbons, which is a really potent greenhouse gas used in our refrigeration systems. We also did see some sector-specific regulations that have made a big difference, notably the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy. These are those standards that come out from EPA and DOT that require each new generation of car to get more and more efficient. We've seen some administrations use executive action to try to move forward. You know, the Obama administration used executive action to join the Paris Agreement. Trump used it to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Biden used it to pull back into the Paris Agreement. And then notably, you know, we've seen some really significant state level action. States are the laboratories of democracy. So just one example is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is a power sector cap and trade program that is run on the northeast part of our country. So a bunch of our northeastern states are members of RGGI and have actually capped emissions out of their power sector. Okay, so that's the story of what happened to date, the quickest overview possible. I'll pause again before I get to the meat of the program, which is what are we here to talk about, the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, so now we're going to turn to what actually did happen. As I mentioned, it's been a rocky road, but we actually have some good news to talk about. So first, let me give the broadest aperture, the biggest picture of what this bill is. It is compromise legislation. And by compromise, I mean compromise among the very tight Democratic slim majorities. It passed on party line vote, so only the Democrats voted for it. And it used a process known as reconciliation, which is this Senate maneuver that allows them to pass about one bill a year without a filibuster-proof majority. They only need a simple majority, so 51 votes. But every single thing in a reconciliation package has to have a direct budgetary impact. And it was signed into law by Biden last summer in August of 2022. It's really big. It's about 700 plus pages. And it includes an estimated $370 billion in climate and energy funding over a 10-year time horizon. This bill is almost all carrots, and by that I mean tax incentives and rebates and grants. And notably, there is no legislative backstop to guarantee that emissions are going to take place. There is no cap. There is no market-based mechanism that ensures that if you do not comply, you get a fine. That said, most of the modeling that's looked at the potential of this bill has projected that it could cut emissions by about 40% below 2005 levels this decade. So huge cuts. And it does this in two main ways. It makes clean energy cheap now, and it invests in future solutions. But when I talk about this, I always say the most important thing about this bill is that it passed. So Jesse Jenkins, we're going to be looking at some of his modeling in a minute. He's a researcher out of Princeton. He tweeted when it passed, you know, it's done. The Inflation Reduction Act has passed the nigh impossible hurdle of the US Senate. This literally changes everything. Robinson Meyer, who was then a reporter at The Atlantic, he wrote, the bill's passage in the Senate is the most significant climate news since China announced 2 years ago that it would aim to achieve net zero by 2060, perhaps even since the adoption of the Paris Agreement 5 years earlier. And then perhaps my favorite, after Biden signed it into law, Barack Obama retweeted, this is a BFD. So let's talk about why this is such a big deal. There's a few lenses you could use to look at that. One is we now have historic levels of spending in the climate and energy space. This is a chart out of the Rocky Mountain Institute that looks at average annual spending in billions. You can see back in the 90s, there was just a little bit of spending going on in the climate and energy space that grew slightly in the early 2000s. Under Obama's term, you can see the stimulus funding in light blue. That's the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And then in comes Biden. The dark blue at the bottom is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the purple is the CHIPS Act. Both of those notably were bipartisan bills. But the big deal is the turquoise, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so why do I say the big deal? Well, let's look at Jesse Jenkins modeling out of his Zero Lab out of Princeton, where he looks at how these different Biden bills will impact our national emissions. So let me orient you to this chart. The dark solid black line is looking at historic CO2 emissions. So these are net emissions. That means our total emissions minus the amount that's being sucked up by our forests and soil and other carbon sinks. So those are, the dark line is what has actually happened. You'll see in 2005, as a country, we were emitting about 6.6 billion tons. That number is important for several reasons, but most important for this conversation is most of our political targets are built off of 2005 levels. And so that horizontal gray line is Biden's target, which is to reduce emissions by 2030, 50% below that 2005 level. So from the 2021 dot on that black line, you'll see a series, a wedge of different colored lines. Those are modeling projections. So using Zero Lab's model to project what would happen in the future based on different policy scenarios. So that top dotted black line looks at where they project emissions would be by 2035 if Biden hadn't passed any of his policies, so frozen policies. If he had just passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it would be the red line. So you can see there's not a huge gap between that dotted black line and the red line. This is why you may hear people say that the infrastructure bill was incredibly important and includes lots of enabling funding for climate priorities, but in and of itself, it was not a climate bill. The purple line is the Inflation Reduction Act. And you'll see it gets you on a pathway that doesn't quite meet Biden's 50% below by 2030. I think they have it at 42% below by 2030. But by 2035, you've hit that target. So this kind of changes the trajectory of US greenhouse gas emissions. And interestingly, the delta between that purple line and the green line, that's the Build Back Better Act that I said passed the House, but not the Senate, that included $500 billion in climate priorities. There's not a huge delta there. The one thing that you're not seeing between those is that the Build Back Better Act had a backstop. So it had a clean electricity standard built in. There were actually penalties for not making these reductions. We don't have that on our purple trajectory. And then the blue line is, what if in 2021, we had just gotten on a path for net zero emissions by mid-century? Okay, so to understand how the Inflation Reduction Act kind of gets us onto that purple pathway, it's helpful to get a sense of just all of the different spending categories and tax credits and rebates that are packaged together into this big bill. I'm going to do, once again, a very quick high-level summary into what's in there, not even touching on all of the different provisions. I don't expect that someone can listen to me tell all of these things and understand deep in your bones what it actually does. So after we go through a series of what's in it, I'll pull out 5 key themes that kind of help bring it on home. So the first category of spending categories is clean energy tax credits. This includes a suite of different things, including a new clean electricity production tax credit and investment tax credit. So the production tax credit, these are tech neutral, anything that produces electricity in a zero carbon way. You could either claim a production tax credit, so you get a tax credit for every megawatt of electricity you generate, or you can get an investment tax credit, which is like a lump sum when you build the plant. You can get cash in the tax credit. It also includes a bunch of different tax credits aimed at electric vehicle purchasing. So we now have a tax credit for new EVs, for used EVs, for leased EVs, as well as for commercial fleets. There is a suite of credits looking at carbon management. So this includes an expansion of the 45Q tax credit. Those are tax credits for carbon capture and direct air capture. There's also money to support low carbon materials and federal procurement. So it's about $2 billion for the General Service Administration to acquire and install low carbon building materials and products. There is also money in here for residential energy efficiency. So this includes tax credits if you want to put rooftop solar on the top of your home. There's also now $1,200 every year in tax credits that you can cash in against energy efficient windows or doors. You can actually have up to $2,000 for heat pumps. So you'll notice I've been saying tax credit, tax credit, tax credit. When you're thinking about residential, you actually have to owe the federal government money at the end of the year to use a tax credit. So the tax credit reduces that federal liability on your tax bill. We know that many low and moderate income families, they don't actually owe the federal government taxes at the end of the year. They're getting taxes back from the federal government. And so the IRA creates a series of rebate programs for income qualified individuals with the idea that at the point of sale, so when you go to purchase it, instead of having to wait till you pay taxes, it would reduce the cost of things like energy efficient doors and windows and heat pumps at the point of sale. And so there's a program called the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program that provides up to $14,000 per household for things like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and electric stoves. I mentioned that the theory of change here is make clean energy cheap now and then invest in future technologies. And so under that latter category of investing in future technologies, there's a suite of programs aimed at the energy innovation sector. This includes money, about $5.8 billion to DOE, aimed at projects that would reduce emissions from energy intensive industries. So think about steel and concrete. There's also money to invest in our national lab infrastructure, which does a lot of basic research. There are provisions aimed at offshore wind as well as oil and gas. Remember, this is a compromise legislation, especially with Joe Manchin. So there are some provisions to support the oil and gas system within this bill. We're going to talk about those in a minute, but just very high level. It lifts the offshore wind moratorium for developing offshore wind along the southeastern US and Eastern Gulf. There's also a small amount of money, about $100 million for planning about how you could actually bring that energy from offshore wind onshore to our major energy loads. It ties the leases of the offshore wind, which are owned, the land is owned by the federal government. It ties those land leases to oil and gas leases. This was part of the compromise. So every time the US government now wants to lease land for offshore wind, it has to hold a similar one for the oil and gas sector, but it does raise royalty rates, so it makes it a little bit more expensive. And then we'll talk about this because this is the one stick in the bill. It also includes a methane emission reduction program. There is a suite of investments in community investment and energy justice. The Biden administration estimates that these priorities have about $60 billion worth of grants and tax incentives as part of this bill. I've seen other independent analyses showing it's more close to about $48 billion, but either way, there's a lot of money for these priorities. This includes about $2.8 billion for their environmental and climate justice block grants. These are grants that are available for projects related to climate change and air pollution. So it could include air pollution monitoring or extreme heat risk mitigation. There's also $3 billion in neighborhood access and equity grants. So that can be used for things like reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, managing stormwater runoff, addressing urban heat island. There are grants to reduce emissions around our ports. So about $3 billion to the EPA to do this, as well as about $1 billion to try to invest in clean heavy duty vehicles like school buses and garbage trucks. And most of that money is set aside for communities who are located in non-attainment areas, so communities that have high air pollution. There's also almost $10 billion to the USDA to support clean energy in our rural communities through our rural electric co-ops. There is some money in here to try to streamline the permitting process. I'm sure many of you all have heard this as an issue that continues to come up in Congress. This is not a permitting reform bill by any means, but there is some money around the edges to support this. there's about $760 million for grants to facilitate the siting of interstate electricity transmission lines. There's also some money going to the agencies that do the reviews for permitting. So there's something like $40 million, for instance, going to the EPA to support staffing to make reviews go faster. There's also money for clean energy financing. So part of the theory of change here is that no one can make this clean energy transition on their own, not even the federal government. They really need business and industry to come along and invest in this future. And so there is money set aside to help that relationship. So to help the federal government finance the clean energy transition. This includes $40 billion to DOE's Loan Program Office to make available loan and loan guarantee authority. This is also includes a pretty innovative new program. There's $27 billion for the EPA to start a national green bank known as the Clean Energy Deployment Bank. And then last but not least, there is money set aside in here for ag and forest. There's about $25 billion provided to help farmers, ranchers, forest landowners adopt climate smart conservation practices. So this includes about $8.5 billion in grants for the EQIP program, which helps landowners invest in soil carbon storage and decrease their nitrous oxide emissions. It also includes things like almost $2 billion for the National Forest System to invest in wildfire risk reducing activities. So as you can see, there is a lot of money and a lot of different programs. This is not a policy that has one kind of united theory of change. The theory of change is to spend money on clean energy and try to make future solutions cheaper. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's hard to hear someone rattle off all the things in the Inflation Reduction Act and know what to think about it. So I'm going to draw out 5 kind of key themes. And then when I'm done with my talk, so we can open it up for Q&A after that. So one thing that is incredibly important about the Inflation Reduction Act is it provides policy certainty. As I mentioned, it has a 10-year time horizon. So most of the key provisions go out to at least 2032. Some actually extend beyond that. And that's something we just haven't had in this space before. And the poster child for the lack of policy certainty is our wind energy production tax credit. So production tax credits for the wind sector allowed all of our new wind plants to earn a tax credit for every megawatt of electricity they were producing. And Congress passed the first one of these back in 1992. It was set to expire in 1999. And since then, they've actually renewed this policy 12 different times, including sometimes retroactively. So allowing it to expire and then going back and applying it retroactively. And in doing so, the industry had a hard time planning. So you can see kind of a classic example of the cliffs that this policy uncertainty produced is back in 2012. That was projected to be the last year of the wind production tax credit. And so all of the wind developers rushed to get their projects online in that calendar year so they could take advantage of that subsidy. And then boom, in comes 2013. The pipeline has all been backloaded and there's not many projects for the industry to execute in that year, even though Congress ended up extending the policy. We now have a clean energy production tax credit that runs out till 2032, which is something we haven't had before. Environmental justice is also a key theme to look at. I would say the good is that it's directly addressed in this bill. As I mentioned, the Biden administration estimates that there's about $60 billion worth of grants and tax credits aimed directly at environmental justice priorities. Even though I've seen some independent analyses that are slightly lower. The unknown, some of the incentives directly for low-income communities require the states to act. So I mentioned that there is a rebate program for residential energy efficiency for low-income families. though that money is going to flow through the state. So we're going to need all 50 of our state governments to set up that rebate program to allow individuals in their state to get those rebates. We have seen in the past that the federal government has not always accepted federal money, particularly when that money becomes politicized. I'm hopeful that these buckets will not, and people all across our country, not just in certain states, will be able to utilize those incentives. The bad, this is a compromise bill, and the compromise included some priorities for the oil and gas sector that communities who live adjacent to those projects have spoken out against and raised some red flags about. This includes green lighting of some oil and gas leases along the Gulf Coast and in Alaska. Some of those leases did not look like they were going to go through because of community environmental concerns, but are fast-tracked now because they're directly included in this bill. And I mentioned before, they've also tied some oil and gas leases to offshore wind leases, which has the potential to move some additional oil and gas leases forward. Domestic jobs is another kind of key theme to look at. There is a lot in here that is really intended to invest not only in the current job sector, but to invest in our future worker pool. So this includes a tax credit directly geared to domestic manufacturing. So there is a tax credit that you can get if you produce some of these clean energy technologies in the US. So things like solar components or wind turbine components. There's also domestic manufacturing requirements in some of the more substantial tax credits, like the clean electricity production and investment tax credits. They include requirements that the projects that the tax credits support have some domestic manufacturing included. There's some domestic content requirements spread throughout the different credits. You probably hear about this the most within the new tax credit for new EVs. So if you want to claim a new EV tax credit, there's a bunch of different requirements, including that there is a final assembly of that new car in the US, and that the minerals and battery components are sourced from either the US or from qualified countries. There's also some prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, particularly in those production tax credits and in investment tax credits. So not only do you have to buy American-made products, but you have to pay what they call a prevailing wage. So these are good wages to the workers. You also have to have apprenticeship programs that are paid, so helping to train and grow that pipeline of the workforce. The Blue-Green Alliance, which has estimated that the IRA will create more than 9 million jobs over the next decade. There are public health benefits that I think are worth noting. I have only talked about the clean energy and electricity climate provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's also a suite of just healthcare provisions that do things like invest in the Affordable Care Act and expand some of the Medicaid provisions. So there are healthcare provisions as part of this. And then there's a bunch of positive public health benefits that just come from this clean energy transition. So as we decrease our use of fossil fuels, we're improving air quality by decreasing things like NOx and SOx, and that directly impacts premature mortality. And then there's a few grants that directly invest in public health outcomes, like the environmental and climate justice block grants and neighborhood access grants, which can fund things like reducing indoor air quality, or reducing urban heat island. And then last but not least, there is one stick, and I think that's worth really pointing out. While most of it is carrots, there is the methane emissions reduction program that will put a price on methane pollution from the oil and gas sector, which is the primary source of our methane pollution. This is important because methane is extremely potent. It's a short-lived greenhouse gas. And there are estimates that a significant portion of the warming that we're experiencing today is actually a result of methane emissions. So now EPA is charged with imposing a charge on oil and gas sources for emissions that are above some industry thresholds starting in 2025. And these are substantial fees. The fees will start at $900 a ton and rise to $1,500 a ton. And with that, I will end my kind of whirlwind tour of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions that people may have. Let's see. So I see Tish wrote in here, it seems that a lot of funding, especially EJ focused, is grants based. Can you talk briefly about the potential roles of academia or NGOs to help communities access these funds? Yes, there is a lot of grant money out there. We have seen lots of different grants from lots of different agencies. I think it is incumbent on kind of the community as a whole to work in tandem to try to make the most of this money. We know that many of our smaller community-based organizations may not be prepared to, on their own, jump through all the hoops it takes to get through the federal grant process. We've seen some projects pop up to try to support that, like the Justice 40 initiative, which is helping to support some of these community-based organizations get in the pipeline. But I do think it's a little bit of an all hands on deck moment where it's a good opportunity for some of our larger NGOs as well as academia to think about critical partnerships to help not only access the funding that's available, but to make sure it's going to all of our community partners. I know sometimes it's hard to ask questions on a webinar, but happy to take more if there are.
Hi, Blair. Thanks for the talk. I appreciate it. I had a question about carbon capture and what are your thoughts and what the Inflation Reduction Act is going to do about using carbon capture as a way to reach that net zero target, but at the same time, carbon capture can often be also still a huge source of pollution and emissions.
So I would say under that environmental justice bucket, one of the concerns you have heard is around the carbon capture programs within the Inflation Reduction Act. I tend to see it as there is money going to most of the solutions that are out there, and there is a real potential for kind of most of these solutions to play some role in the ecosystem. So we've had the 45Q tax credit on the books now for several years, which is the tax credit that directly supports carbon capture and direct air capture. We've seen some uptake, but not significant, and this will expand it. And so we shall see if it's able to compete in the marketplace and become one of those technologies that takes off. So someone asked, does the greenhouse gas emissions graph look different for Georgia compared to the national view? We have Marilyn on the line. So Marilyn, if I get this wrong, feel free to interrupt. But I think if you look at that macro level for the state as a whole, it tracks somewhat similar, where we see transportation as our largest source of emissions, followed by the power sector. If you start looking, at any smaller level, like a certain city or a certain county, you're going to see somewhat different trends depending on where you are in our state. But for the state as a whole, transportation is also now our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Is there an expiration on any of the tax credits or rebates? That's coming from Kaya. So yes, most of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act have a 10-year time frame where they go out to 2032. I will say that there is a cool provision, I think it's cool, in the investment and production tax credits. So they're set to expire in 2032 as well, unless the electric power sector does not emit 75% less carbon than they did in 2022. So if we're not making enough progress, I know it's like a lot of numbers, wrap your head around, but if you're not making enough progress, if it's not clean enough by 2032, those tax credits actually automatically extend. Are there any municipalities that have been successful in getting grant funding so far? I do not know the answer to that. I will say that a lot of these programs are just now opening up. And so the answer may be yes, but I think we're going to be hearing more and more about who is getting this money in the coming months. It's a big bill to roll out. And so they're working hard to get those grants out the door, but they're probably not, moving that fast yet. We're also seeing things like a lot of the enabling legislation around some of the tax credits are still rolling out. So the EVs tax credits, for example, we continue to get updates on who will qualify and what qualifies. So for instance, we just learned a few weeks ago that now if you lease an EV, that tax credit actually resides under the commercial vehicle tax credit. So there's no income restrictions under a leased EV like there is if you buy a new one. There also is no domestic manufacturing or content requirements for a leased EV like there is for a new EV. So I think this falls into one of those things where communicating out to people about what's actually available is a little bit cumbersome, a little bit challenging, but I do think it's really important that people start to wrap their heads around all of the different funding that's available. Let's see. You touched base on methane gas emissions now being measured and accounted for in the oil and gas industry. My question is, was there any indication in this act mentioning or incorporating methane gas in the cattle or dairy industry? I do not know the answer to that. I do not think so. But I have to tell you, of all the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, the ag and forestry are the ones that I know least well. So if anyone knows of one, you can add it to the chat, but I'm not aware of a provision aimed at methane gas from the cattle industry. Oh, good. And Tish said, Athens, Georgia has received some DOE funds. So that's good. Go Athens. Let's see how my computer's about to die. Regarding the oil and gas lease sales that have been fast-tracked as a result of being included in the offshore wind leases or otherwise part of this legislation, are you aware if those will be advertised through BLM's oil and gas lease sales page per usual, or is the notice posted elsewhere? I do not know the answer to that. I assume they will be noticed similarly. I don't know why they would be noticed differently, but stranger things have happened, I guess. So if someone knows the answer to that, get a reply in the chat. Marilyn, some modelers and experts feel that the modeled reduction forecasts you've shown are overly optimistic for a variety of reasons. Yes. So here's the thing that's really tricky about modeling the Inflation Reduction Act. One is many of these tax credits are not capped. So I've actually seen some estimates that this bill is not a $370 billion climate and energy bill, but maybe an $800 billion climate and energy bill. There was a leaked Credit Suisse report that showed that. So for one thing, we just don't know what the appetite is going to be. Are we going to see companies and individuals really take the federal government up on these? The grants are capped, the tax credits are not capped. So that's one thing. And then Marilyn points out some other really important things, like, is there a supply chain available? So we know, for instance, that if you are going to hit these domestic manufacturing requirements and content requirements, it's going to require a scaling up, not just of our end users, but of everything going back down the supply chain. Are the modelers who are forecasting these huge emission reductions, are they accounting for that? Can we actually do that within the 10-year time horizon? This could be something that we continue to have to update those projections. I think certainly under some optimistic, but probably reasonable estimations, we can get there, but that requires people to take up the federal government on these huge discounts that it's putting out there into the marketplace. Good questions. Is the funding allocated into the EPA's Green Bank, primarily business industry oriented, or who else may be eligible to apply for that funding? So the Green Bank money is really cool. It's gonna be housed at EPA, but my understanding is that it's to support regional, local, tribal, state deployment of those funds. And I can pass along some like summary language of what they've released so far to Sophia to share. But this is one where we haven't seen kind of the full picture of how it's going to roll out yet. So we're going to be seeing some enabling text to support their green bank. But it's $27 billion. It's a pretty significant portion of the money that's going to EPA as a part of this bill. Great. Well, thank you all.
Blair, I actually had one more question.
Sure.
I was just curious about the domestic manufacturing requirements for tax credits. Is there any like incentive for the auto manufacturing industry to meet those requirements, or is it on the consumer to kind of be vigilant about the production chain of the vehicle they're interested in?
No, it's on the manufacturer, and you actually can see DOE continues to have a list of what makes and models qualify for different tax credits. So you can actually search to see if your favorite EV qualifies. They have not put out the regulations yet around the domestic content requirement for the batteries. That's expected in March. So some of the vehicles that currently, if you went right now and bought an EV that are eligible under the new EV tax credit, may not be eligible come March once they release the language around the battery components. So there's actually a little bit of some wiggle room that we will not be afforded going forward, probably as soon as March for the new EVs. But those requirements only matter if you're getting a new EV, and there's also some income-based requirements for the purchaser. So you really do have to look to see if both your car and you yourself qualify for a new EV tax credit. And I'll just say a shameless plug on the Drawdown Georgia website. We have information about all of this. We've done some blog posts to help guide people on how to utilize the EV tax credits as well as the residential energy efficiency tax credits. We also have what we call a toolkit, like a how-to guide on how to adopt an electric vehicle that also walks through and links out on these new IRA tax credits for EVs. Great. Well, thanks so much. It was a pleasure talking with you all. I appreciate you joining.
Thank you so much.
And someone asked if this recording will be posted somewhere. It will be posted on the Georgia Climate Project YouTube channel. We will also have it on our website at the georgiaclimateproject.org. And then if you're interested in signing up for our newsletters, you can find that on our website as well.
Thank you to Sophia for organizing. And again, thank you to Blair. This was really awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks you all for coming. Have a great week.
Thank you all.